Now that we have talked a little bit about how the eye works, I would like to talk a little bit about how the eye contributes to detecting colors for color vision. We should start by noting that there is more than one way that an object could be said to have color. For example, in this slide from a previous topic, we can see that this LED is emitting blue light. We know that the light is blue because we look at it and see that it is giving off blue light. That's very different from how most objects around us are seen to have color, and that is that they reflect certain colors if those colors are shown upon them. So if you have, for example, a red t-shirt in a totally dark room, it doesn't look red, it's in the dark. But if you shine white light on that shirt, it will absorb much of the green and blue that is shown upon it and reflect only the red back. Then when you see that shirt, you see the red light reflected off of it. A third way that an object could be said to have color is by being transparent or translucent to certain colors of light while absorbing other colors. So rather than reflecting it back, as with the red t-shirt example, something like stained glass is allowing the light to pass through. In fact, with some types of stained glass, you may notice that if you are on the outside of this door shining a light at it, or watching the sun come over your shoulder at this stained glass, you would not see the color reflected back to you. That depends on how the glass is stained. For a situation like that, if your eye is on the right side of the screen here and the light source is on the left side of the screen, you can see these colors coming in, the white light coming in from the left, hitting this glass, and most of it being absorbed. The energy would be absorbed as thermal energy. But the blue light is able to pass through clearly. That's why on the other side of the glass, you would see this as blue glass. For some types of stained glass, that means that if you were actually standing on the left side of the screen here, looking directly at this glass, it might look very black to you because the light is absorbed in the red, orange, yellow, green, and violet wavelengths, and the blue light passes through. It's possible that none of it is reflected back to you, depending on where you are compared to the light source and compared to the glass. And that's definitely not true for all types of colored glass, but for some it is. That brings us to a few points that are actually very important for understanding how light interacts with matter. Most materials that are opaque to visible light are not opaque to all sorts of light. They are actually transparent to certain wavelengths. And most materials that are transparent to visible light are actually opaque to some other wavelengths. We think of material as being opaque or transparent based on the light that we're able to see with our eyes. But there is more to it than that. For example, transparent glass may be transparent to visible light, but may block ultraviolet light or infrared light. And of course, you are probably familiar with the fact that X-rays, which are a form of electromagnetic radiation, are able to pass through parts of human tissue because the tissue is therefore transparent to that wavelength. Meanwhile, other parts of our body are opaque to that wavelength. That's the whole point of why an X-ray image is useful, is because the light is able to pass through some of the material easily, but not through all of it. The human eye is adapted to be able to absorb and therefore detect red light, green light, and blue light. Shown on this graph is also ultraviolet light, which is a cone type that we do not have in our eyes, but some types of animals do. So some animals are able to see ultraviolet light, and other animals are only able to accurately detect red from green and may be colorblind in the entire blue to ultraviolet range. Our ability to make sense of our detection of red light compared to green compared to blue is what allows us to see different colors. And for a person who is not able to discern one color type from another, that is what makes them able to see objects but not tell, for example, red from green. That person would then be colorblind. I would like to note that some researchers have a lot of fun trying to figure out what, for example, birds who see ultraviolet light, what other birds look like in the ultraviolet spectrum. And they come up with these false color images like in the bottom right here, what birds see. But of course, a bird wouldn't see that as green and blue and violet. It would see it as ultraviolet, which is a color I can't describe to you because I can't see it and neither can you. So it wouldn't be green and blue, but it's still really interesting though to recognize that compared to a bird, we are all colorblind throughout the ultraviolet spectrum. Now back to human vision. If you see red and green and blue light all at the same time, you might interpret that as red and green and blue, but you might, if the colors are in close enough proximity to each other, interpret that as white light. So this is, as it says here, a series of images of what LCD screens from phones or computers or a calculator look like under a microscope. You can even see a little bit of this effect if you have water droplets on your screen. The area that looks white is probably being projected as red and green and blue. That is how pretty much every computer screen and phone screen works. That's also how projectors work. Now, old-fashioned movie projectors would just project white light and put film strips in front of it, but most color projection systems today actually project red and green and blue, and some also project like a white and yellow to try to bring brightness to the images. But you only need red, green, and blue to convince the human eye that it's seeing every possible color. It is the different amount of red compared to blue compared to green that convinces you that you are seeing yellow or convinced that you are seeing white. What you are seeing in this image here is where red light and green light overlap. You actually see yellow because your brain interprets that the cones that see red and green are both receiving that light color. Your brain interprets that to be yellow because yellow is between red and green on the spectrum. In other words, actual yellow light is detected by both your red cones and your green cones. So if I shine just red and green light in equal intensities, I can trick your brain into taking the message from the eye and assuming that that is actual yellow light as opposed to red and green simultaneously. The overlap between red and blue is magenta, and the overlap between blue and green is cyan. The overlap of red, green, and blue in equal intensities in the same place at the same time is white light. So let's be clear about what that means in terms of an object appearing a certain color because it is reflecting light. Not because it is transparent like stained glass, and also not like it is emitting like a light, but just most opaque objects that are sitting around reflecting light to you. An object that is appearing blue in white light is, of course, absorbing red, orange, yellow, green, and violet if those are shown upon it. So if only blue light is shining on this blue object, then the blue light is reflected and the object appears blue. If white light, which is the combination of the spectrum red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, if actual white light is shown upon an object and only blue light is reflected from that object, then we see only the blue light reflecting from that object. That's why we would say this is a blue object. If white light is shown upon an object and only red light is able to reflect from that object, then we would look at that object and say that object is red because we're only able to detect the red light. None of the other colors are reflecting off of it. But I'd like you to consider what that means when not white light is shining on an object. For example, if you have a white object and you only shine red light on it, the white object appears white to us in white light because it's reflecting all colors. But if it only has red light to reflect, then I will see that as a red object. I'm only able to detect the red light because that's all that is present in this particular situation. And of course, some objects absorb all of the colors that we shine on them, and that's why those objects appear black. But consider what this means if you're wearing a red t-shirt and I come along and shine only blue light on you. If only blue light is shining in and it is being absorbed, then no light is being reflected from your t-shirt, and I would not see your t-shirt as red. Standing in red clothing in a blue spotlight, you would appear to be wearing black clothing. So again, for reflective color, the color that an object appears in white light is usually what we would say is the object's actual color. And if we were to shine only red, green, and blue light on that object, then it still has the ability to reflect some combination of red and green and blue that our eyes would then be able to detect. The different intensities of these colors would allow us to perceive that the object is some color other than just pure red, pure green, or pure blue. For example, a yellow book in sunlight reflects yellow, but it probably also reflects a fair amount of green, orange, and red. It's absorbing the blue and the purple light and reflecting back green and red, and our eyes detect both the green and the red, and we then say, oh, this is an object that appears yellow. What happens if I shine only red, green, and blue light on that object? Well, the blue light is still absorbed, and the red and green are still reflected. Our eye can't determine the difference between orange and red, green and yellow in the eyeball itself. That is an interpretation that is made in the brain based on the intensities of these lights. So an equal amount of red and green, our eyeball assumes that what we're seeing is not what you see on screen here, but instead this, and we would interpret it as a yellow object. This definitely can get very confusing, especially because there is a difference between shining different lights of different colors in the same place at the same time versus having what it says here, subtractive transparent filters. If you have a white light with a yellow filter on it, then what that yellow filter is doing is absorbing blue light and only allowing the red and green to pass through. This is a really interesting topic to get into if you have an opportunity to play around with some color mixing lights, and if you don't, then it seems very abstract and it can get really confusing. I do want to point out that artists have to spend a lot of time worrying about what kind of lighting is going to be present on their artwork. If your painting is only going to be viewed in dim lighting, or is only going to be viewed in unnatural light that is not really white, then the colors you're using in the studio might not be the same as the ones that will be observed by the people who are trying to look at your artwork. I will also be very clear about the fact that mixing paints or crayon colors is not the same as mixing light, and I'm not trying to suggest it is. Paint combinations would actually come from either cyan or magenta or yellow or black paint. You could create all of the colors of the palette with just these four right here. If I were to shine red light only on these colors, then what you would see is that the red light is absorbed by the black paint and by the cyan paint, but is reflected out by the yellow and the magenta. In fact, if we shone just red light on these four colors, we would see that two of them look black and two of them look red. In the presence of red and green, I would see that the green light is also absorbed by the black paint, but the green is then also absorbed by the magenta and is reflected back by the yellow and by the cyan. So if I had red and green light shining on here, I would see that this looked like green paint, this looked like red paint, this looks like yellow because it's green and red both, and this looks like black because it is absorbing both types of light that are shining on it. And then the addition of blue light would allow us to see what we're actually seeing. In fact, if you are currently viewing this on a screen, then what you are seeing is some combination of red, green, and blue that looks like yellow in one place because you're seeing red and green simultaneously, magenta in another place because you're seeing red and blue simultaneously, and cyan in another place because you're seeing blue and green simultaneously. Again, I think this is a really fascinating topic. That's why I've provided a couple of supplemental videos. There is part of the OpenStax textbook, chapter 26, that talks about color vision, but you might note that it does not have any homework questions on that section in the back of the chapter. So it's almost like free knowledge that you learned something and wouldn't get asked questions about it. I hope that's not disappointing. But maybe we can talk some more about color vision in class.